When I first moved into the neighborhood, I never thought I'd be at war with the homeowners association. Like most people, I assumed paying dues meant my lawn would stay trimmed, the pool would stay clean, and the neighborhood would stay safe. I wasn't the kind of person who went looking for trouble. I worked hard during the week, spent weekends doing projects in the garage, and took pride in my home. The house was perfect for me. A decent-sized yard, a good-sized driveway, and a quiet street just far enough from the city noise to feel peaceful. I had saved for years to buy it. And one of the things I loved most was being able to keep my pride and joy close by. My pickup truck, that truck wasn't just transportation. It was the result of countless hours of overtime, years of saving, and more than a few busted knuckles in the garage. I had put my soul into it. The bed was reinforced. The paint job gleamed under the sun, and the engine had a growl that could wake the dead. It was big, sure, but it was mine. For the first few months, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. My neighbors waved politely. I kept my yard in perfect condition. I followed the rules, paid my dues, and minded my business. But as I quickly learned, the HOA doesn't always care about reason, fairness, or common sense. Sometimes, it only cares about control. It started with a letter. The envelope arrived on a warm afternoon, tucked neatly against my front door. At first, I assumed it was just another reminder about neighborhood events or lawn care tips. But when I tore it open, the words jumped off the page with a sharpness I could almost feel. According to the HOA, my pickup truck was in violation of community standards. The letter claimed my truck was too large, unsightly, and detracted from the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. They demanded that I remove it immediately from my driveway and park it elsewhere, or face fines that could climb hundreds of dollars per week. At first, I laughed. Surely this was some kind of mistake. After all, my driveway was private property. The truck wasn't blocking the road. It wasn't broken down or leaking oil. It was polished, well-maintained, and parked neatly where it belonged. But the HOA wasn't joking. 2 days later, another notice appeared. This one was sterner, more aggressive, and written in a way that felt almost threatening. They had attached photos of my truck parked in front of my house, as if it were some kind of criminal evidence. The fines were already being calculated. That's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was personal. I started asking around, quietly at first. A few neighbors shrugged it off, saying the HOA president was a stickler for appearances. Others whispered that she had a vendetta against larger vehicles, claiming they lowered property values. I didn't know if that was true, but it was clear I had been targeted. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I paid good money to live here. I followed the rules. My truck wasn't hurting anyone. Who were they to tell me what I could or couldn't park in my own driveway? The situation escalated quickly. Within a week, I received another letter, this time hand-delivered. The president of the HOA had personally signed it, reminding me that failure to comply with community guidelines would result in escalating consequences. The way it was worded felt smug, as if they were daring me to push back. For a brief moment, I considered giving in. I thought about renting a spot in a storage lot or parking it somewhere out of sight just to avoid the stress. But every time I imagined driving past my own home and not seeing my truck where it belonged, the frustration boiled inside me. It wasn't just about a vehicle anymore. It was about principle. I knew if I let the HOA bully me into submission, it wouldn't stop with the truck. Today it was the driveway. Tomorrow it could be my garden, my paint color, or the decorations I put up for the holidays. No, I decided. This wasn't something I was going to roll over on. That's when I started researching. I dug through the HOA bylaws line by line late into the night. The more I read, the more I realized how vague and contradictory their rules were. Some sections banned oversized vehicles, but never defined what oversized meant. Others mentioned aesthetic concerns, but had no clear guidelines. It was a mess, and a mess I could use to my advantage. The next day, I walked out to my driveway and stared at the truck, gleaming in the sunlight. That's when the idea first sparked in my mind. If the HOA thought my pickup was such a nuisance, maybe it was time they got a closer look at it. I wasn't going to hide it. I wasn't going to move it. In fact, I was going to make sure the HOA couldn't avoid it. At that moment, the plan began forming. A plan that would take their threats, their fines, and their smug letters and turn them back on them in the most ironic way possible. Because if the HOA didn't want my truck in my driveway, maybe they'd enjoy having it parked in theirs. And with that single thought, the first step of my revenge was set in motion. After the seed of the idea had planted itself in my head, it grew fast. There was no turning back. The feeling was equal parts exhilaration and righteous fury. I spent the next morning in a blur of purpose, pacing the garage and running possibilities through my mind. It needed to be legal, symbolic, and impossible for the HOA to ignore. It needed to be clever enough to expose their pettiness without putting me at risk of losing more than my temper. It had to be bold. I started by mapping out the HOA office, where they held meetings, where notices were posted, and the small strip of grass in front of the building with the neatly trimmed hedges that looked like they belonged in a magazine. The HOA president, the woman who had signed every threatening letter, loved that spot. It was her stage. People came to that office to drop off payments, ask for permission for paint colors, and to feel the reassuring blandness of conformity. If I wanted to make a point, that was the place. I measured distances, timing, and sightlines. I photographed the office from different angles and noted the patterns of traffic and the times the president arrived and left. I did all of this under the guise of neighborhood observation, something that looked more like curiosity than aggression. I didn't want to scare anyone. I wanted to make sure the plan was airtight. The last thing I needed was to hand the HOA an easy excuse to escalate. Next, I inspected my truck. It was spotless, the chrome still catching reflections of the sky, and the bed was empty by design. It would be important that nothing about the truck suggested malintent. It had to remain an emblem of normalcy, a hardworking vehicle that belonged in a driveway, not in headlines or legal filings. I cleaned the windows, checked the tire pressures, and made sure the license plate was visible and up to date. If this was going to be a test of the HOA's principles, I wanted them to fail on their own terms. I also prepared documentation. The bylaws I had combed through earlier were printed and highlighted, with notes on ambiguous phrasing and missing definitions. I made copies of my registration and insurance, and pulled up property lines and municipal codes that supported the right to park on one's own driveway. If this flipped into a legal battle, I wanted to be ready to stand on something firmer than indignation. But the heart of the plan would be symbolism. The idea of driving the truck into the HOA's literal front yard felt like poetic justice. Not reckless vandalism, just a calm, undeniable reminder that their power rested on the perception of control, not actual authority. I pictured the truck in front of the office, exactly where people walked in and out, impossible to ignore, yet not violating the law in any obvious way. The truck would speak without words. When the Data Act arrived, I woke before dawn. There was a stillness over the neighborhood that felt conspiratorial, like the world was briefly pausing to watch a small, calculated rebellion unfold. I dressed in plain clothes and moved with quiet purpose. I slid into the driver's seat, the familiar hum of the engine settling my nerves. The streets were empty, the air cool enough to see my breath when I exhaled. Even the birds seemed to whisper conspiratorially from the power lines. It felt surreal driving past my own home, glancing at the driveway where the truck had lived for years. The sight of my house without it tugged at something protective inside me. But there was no turning back now. This was bigger than nostalgia. It was a stand. I followed the route I had scouted, navigating side streets to avoid cameras and nosy early commuters. Every turn was deliberate, every stop calculated. There was a delicious tension between calm and urgency that made my palms sweat. Pulling up to the HOA office felt like arriving at a courtroom. The building's facade, so meticulously curated, loomed like a judge's bench. I parked the truck where it would be visible from the sidewalk and the office windows, leaving space for pedestrian traffic and stable footing for the gawkers I expected to appear once the sun rose. It was important that this not appear hostile. I wanted onlookers to see a man who believed in his rights, not someone seeking spectacle for its own sake. I stepped out and walked around the truck, taking in how perfectly it fit the setting. Its presence felt almost theatrical, an ordinary vehicle placed in an extraordinary context. As expected, a few early risers passed by, doing double takes, whispering in that way people do when they are trying to decide if they should be amused or scandalized. A dog walker slowed, glanced, and made the decision to keep walking. The neighborhood's reaction was already rippling out, and I could sense the subtle recalibration of what was permissible. Within an hour, the HOA's office opened its doors and the first official arrived. I watched from a distance, heart pounding but steady. The person who had signed the letters approached the window, peering at the truck with a mix of horror and disbelief. I imagined the internal calculations spinning. What clause could they cite? What precedent could they find? The truck sat there, immovable and lawful, a mirror held up to their own rules. Word spreads fast in places like this. Within the morning, neighbors were out on their porches, phones in hand, recording and passing around footage. The HOA's own social media began filling with questions and pixelated images, the association attempting to frame the narrative before it could spiral. They posted notices about public safety concerns and unauthorized parking, but their language was cautious, hedging as their legal team consulted invisible counsel. Meanwhile, private messages flew. Some neighbors expressed admiration for the audacity. Others expressed anger at what they called an unnecessary provocation. The community was dividing in real time, reshaping relationships that had seemed stable. The HOA president, always composed in public, was suddenly forced into a reactive role. A flurry of calls, some civil and some sharp, reshaped the morning's calm into a storm. They threatened fines and towing, but there was a problem. The truck had not actually broken any municipal law. It belonged to a resident of the community. It was in a legal parking space, albeit one the HOA did not like. Towing it without clear legal cause would be dangerous for them. It could expose them to liability and public backlash. Their authorship of the neighborhood's rules had limits. That didn't stop the president from trying other tactics. She called the board into an emergency meeting and began drafting notices that were more pointed, searching for ambiguous language to lean on. Private conversations between board members suddenly became more strategic, their casual authority slipping into defensive posturing. It was fascinating to watch bureaucracy scramble when met with an unexpected test. Amid the chaos, I kept to the edges, never shouting, never taunting. My presence was simply a quiet insistence. This truck has a right to be here. I had anticipated the legal hedging and the political maneuvering. I had not anticipated how quickly strangers would pick a side simply based on the shape of the truck. People projected their frustrations and loyalties onto metal and paint. A mundane piece of machinery became the center of an unfolding social experiment. By late afternoon, the tension had escalated into a palpable electricity. Supporters gathered in small clusters, trading stories about being bullied by the HOA or celebrating any victory against institutional overreach. Opponents passed around flyers advocating for strict enforcement of community standards, their language sharp and moralizing. The neighborhood had split into camps, and the friendly waves from when I first moved in felt like a relic from another era. And in the eye of the storm, the truck remained. Its engine cooled in the evening air, but its symbolic warmth lingered. People took photos, posted hashtags, and debated in comment threads. The HOA president drafted another notice, this one with stronger language, while a few brave souls called the local paper. The quiet rebellion I had launched had become a public spectacle. As the sun dipped and the early glow of streetlights flickered on, a dark hum began to build. The president, galvanized and cornered, made a decision that would change everything. A formal complaint would be escalated, and legal counsel would be retained to remove what they were now framing as a public nuisance. It was a line in the sand, a point of no return. The truck sat under the rising moon, innocent and immovable, while the machinery of a governing body prepared for battle. The neighborhood watched, opinions hardening. The next step promised more than fines and notices. It hinted at legal confrontation, social discord, and a test of how far an association could push when a resident refused to bow. The night after my truck first stood in front of the HOA office, I barely slept. Not out of fear, but from the strange thrill of anticipation. Something had shifted in the balance of power, and everyone could feel it. What had started as a letter and a threat had turned into a visible standoff, a test of wills under the glow of street lamps and the hum of whispered conversations. By dawn, the air was thick with tension. Neighbors walked their dogs slower than usual, pausing to glance toward the HOA building. My truck sat proudly in place, reflecting the early sun, a stubborn monument to principle. Its presence no longer looked accidental. It looked intentional. It was a statement carved into the neighborhood's daily rhythm. The HOA president arrived earlier than usual, her posture stiff, her steps sharp with the weight of authority she was struggling to maintain. She glanced at the truck as if it were a personal insult. For someone who thrived on absolute control, the sight must have been intolerable. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her mind, searching for the right combination of intimidation and legality that would erase the challenge. By mid-morning, the HOA made their first official counterattack. Notices were delivered to mailboxes across the community, written with a heavy hand and printed on the same letterhead as my original warnings. The language was urgent, framing my truck as an unauthorized obstruction, a safety concern, and even a potential hazard to the reputation of the neighborhood. It was astonishing how a perfectly legal vehicle had been transformed into a villain on paper. The notice ended with a chilling declaration. The HOA would pursue all necessary remedies, including but not limited to legal action, fines, and towing. The escalation was obvious. They weren't just posturing anymore. They were threatening to bring in outside muscle, lawyers, tow trucks, maybe even law enforcement. And yet woven into the bluster was a thread of weakness. Every claim they made leaned on vague words, not specific ordinances. Every threat was conditional, hedged by may and could. It was a bluff wrapped in legal jargon. Still, the notice rattled some of my neighbors. I saw subtle shifts in body language. The ones who had whispered support the day before now kept their distance. They feared being dragged into a fight that wasn't theirs. Others doubled down, emboldened by the spectacle. A few even left anonymous notes on my porch, thanking me for standing up to the association. One note in particular stuck with me. They've been pushing us for years. Don't give in. You're not alone. The HOA wasn't content to stop at paper threats. By afternoon, they had hired a private towing company. A flatbed truck rolled into the neighborhood, its engine growling like a predator searching for prey. Residents gathered in hushed clusters, cameras in hand, waiting to see what would unfold. The tow truck driver stepped out, scanned the truck, and frowned. He examined the paperwork the HOA had thrust into his hands, then shook his head. It wasn't enough. Without a clear violation of municipal law, he risked legal consequences for towing a vehicle from private property. The HOA president argued, gestured, and grew visibly red with frustration. But the driver refused. He climbed back into his cab, muttered something about not wanting to get sued, and drove off. The crowd that had gathered couldn't help but react. A few chuckled quietly. Others clapped. The HOA president stormed back inside the office, defeated but not finished. I knew this wasn't the end. It was only a setback. If anything, her failure in front of an audience would fuel her determination to crush me harder. That night, I reinforced my defenses. I documented everything: photos of the truck, timestamps, and video recordings of the failed tow attempt. I scanned the HOA's notices, highlighting the inconsistencies and vague threats. If they wanted a legal battle, I was ready to drag them into the spotlight with their own contradictions. But what I didn't anticipate was the ripple effect beyond the neighborhood. By the following day, videos of the confrontation had begun circulating online. Someone had posted clips of the tow truck leaving, spliced with images of the HOA president glaring at my vehicle. The captions were mocking, the tone gleeful. And once the internet gets hold of a story like that, it grows faster than anyone can control. Suddenly, my truck wasn't just a local symbol. It was viral. Comments poured in from strangers around the country. People who had their own stories of overreaching HOAs and controlling neighbors. Supporters called me a hero, while critics warned that I was poking a hornet's nest. News outlets began sniffing around, contacting residents for statements. The HOA, once smug in its authority, now found itself on the defensive in a much larger arena. Of course, this only enraged the president further. She issued yet another notice, this one dripping with venom, accusing me of bringing unwanted attention to the neighborhood and threatening to sue for defamation. It was laughable, but also telling. She wasn't just fighting for rules anymore. She was fighting for pride, for her image as the unshakable leader of the community. The battle lines were clear now. On one side, an HOA desperate to reassert control, flailing with empty threats and legal posturing. On the other, a single resident with a truck, a principal, and growing public support. The neighborhood had become a stage, and everyone was watching. As the third day ended, the air felt heavy with anticipation. The HOA had failed with letters and failed with towing. Their options were shrinking, and their anger was growing. I could feel the storm building, the pressure mounting for them to make a bold move that would either crush me or destroy themselves. The truck sat in the same spot. Unmoved, unbothered, a silent challenge in chrome and steel. And as I watched the streetlights flicker on, I knew the real fight hadn't even started yet. The morning after the tow truck debacle, the neighborhood had changed. It was no longer just a quiet suburb. It had become a battlefield of whispers, glances, and simmering loyalties. The truck still sat proudly in front of the HOA office, gleaming in the sun like a trophy. But underneath that calm exterior, the tension had begun to split the community wide open. Some neighbors avoided me entirely, turning their heads as if proximity to me might invite retribution from the HOA. Others were bolder, offering subtle nods of support or quick words when no one else was listening. The invisible lines dividing the neighborhood were growing sharper, and the president of the HOA, furious at being embarrassed twice in front of her own residents, was determined to retaliate. By mid-morning, another notice appeared, this one thicker, bound in a small packet stapled neatly at the corner. It was longer, more formal, and written with the cold language of attorneys. The HOA had officially retained legal counsel and was pursuing injunctive relief against me. They were threatening to drag me into court, demanding that the truck be removed immediately or face escalating fines, legal fees, and possible liens against my property. For most residents, this kind of language was terrifying. It was meant to crush resistance before it began, to bury people under the weight of legalese and the threat of financial ruin. But I had anticipated this. In fact, I had prepared for it. I sat down with the packet, highlighter in hand, and read every word. They cited vague community standards, leaned heavily on the aesthetic harmony clause, and even attempted to argue that my truck could decrease the market value of surrounding homes. But here was the flaw. They had no concrete definition of what vehicles were actually prohibited. Their own bylaws contradicted themselves, and municipal code didn't support their claims. It was a legal house of cards, impressive at first glance, but flimsy under scrutiny. Still, the threat of court wasn't something to take lightly. Lawsuits could drag on for months, even years, draining time and resources. The HOA was betting that the fear alone would force me to fold. But instead of scaring me off, it only solidified my resolve. If they wanted to go to court, then we would go to court. And the whole neighborhood, and maybe even the world, given the growing online attention, would see just how ridiculous their crusade had become. Meanwhile, the cracks within the HOA itself were beginning to show. Rumors spread of board members questioning the president's leadership, worried that her obsession with my truck was dragging the association into dangerous territory. Some feared the mounting legal bills, others feared the bad publicity, and a few simply didn't agree with the vendetta in the first place. I started receiving quiet messages from unexpected places. A board member slipped me an anonymous email late one night, admitting that they thought the president was overstepping and making the HOA look like fools. They couldn't say it publicly, but it was clear that not everyone on the board was aligned anymore. The president's grip on power, once ironclad, was beginning to loosen. The neighborhood gossip mill went into overdrive. At barbecues and in driveways, conversations shifted from gardening and weather to the truck situation. People debated fiercely, some arguing that rules were rules, others claiming the HOA had gone too far. The once polite surface of the community was now fractured, each side digging in deeper. The truck wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a symbol, and symbols have power. As if the legal threats weren't enough, the HOA attempted another tactic: public shaming. They started circulating flyers accusing me of being a disruptive influence, claiming I was bringing negative attention to the neighborhood. The flyers were slipped into mailboxes, pinned to the community bulletin board, and even posted near the mail center where everyone had to pass by. But the move backfired. Instead of isolating me, it angered residents who saw it as bullying. Some ripped the flyers down. Others posted sarcastic comments online, mocking the association for acting like a playground clique. The more the HOA tried to control the narrative, the more out of control it became. The local press began circling as well. A small suburban paper ran a piece about a neighborhood divided over one resident's truck, and soon larger outlets started calling. The president refused to comment, hiding behind ongoing legal matters, but her silence only fueled speculation. Meanwhile, the viral videos continued to spread, each clip turning the HOA into the butt of the internet's latest joke. The pressure was mounting from all sides. The president, once so confident in her authority, was now cornered. Her refusal to back down wasn't just about rules anymore, it was about pride. She couldn't admit defeat without losing face, so she doubled down, even as her own allies began to waver. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the streetlights blinked on, I stood at my window and watched the truck sitting stoically in front of the HOA office. It looked almost serene, like it belonged there. The thought struck me. The more they fought against it, the more it became part of the landscape. What they had tried so desperately to erase had instead become permanent. But I also knew this wasn't over. Pride is a dangerous fuel, and the HOA president still had plenty of it. She had failed with letters, failed with fines, failed with towing, and now was scrambling with lawyers. Each defeat only made her more desperate. And desperate people make reckless choices. The neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Would she force the lawsuit into court? Would the board finally fracture and turn against her? Or would she take an even riskier step, one that might break the fragile balance completely? The cracks were widening, and everyone could see it. The only question left was whether the HOA would implode quietly or explode spectacularly for everyone to witness. And as the moon rose that night, I had the uneasy sense that the explosion was closer than anyone realized. By the time the HOA's legal threats reached their peak, the neighborhood felt less like a community and more like a war zone. Not a war of violence, but of paper, whispers, and symbols. Every mailbox carried the weight of notices and counter-notices. Every glance between neighbors carried suspicion, curiosity, or quiet solidarity. And at the center of it all, unmoving and unbothered, was my truck. The lawsuit papers arrived in a thick envelope, stamped with the authority of the court. The HOA president had gone all in, officially filing for an injunction to force the removal of the truck and demanding thousands in damages for supposed harm to property values. Reading through it, I couldn't decide if I was more angry or amused. Their case leaned on shaky arguments, circular definitions, and half-truths. They had even attached photos of the truck as Exhibit A, as if its very existence was proof of wrongdoing. But desperation oozed from every page. They weren't building a solid case. They were grasping at straws, hoping sheer force and intimidation would wear me down. I knew better. I had already retained a lawyer of my own, someone who specialized in property rights and who, after one look at the HOA's paperwork, smirked and told me, "They're standing on quicksand." The HOA didn't know it yet, but their crusade had turned into a trap of their own making. Still, that didn't stop them from trying every dirty trick in the book. They issued fines daily, stacking them like poker chips in the hopes of scaring me with the total. They sent aggressive letters not just to me, but to my mortgage company, insinuating that I was in violation of covenants. They even attempted to restrict my access to community amenities, barring me from the pool and gym as if I were some kind of criminal. The irony was laughable. They wanted me gone so badly, yet every action they took only pushed me deeper into the spotlight. The more they tried to shame me, the more people rallied behind me. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began to murmur their frustrations aloud. Stories poured out of unfair fines, ridiculous rules, and petty vendettas carried out by the HOA over the years. My truck had become a catalyst, a symbol of resistance against years of quiet oppression. The online attention only fueled the fire. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as the Battle of the Pickup Truck. Commentators dissected the absurdity of the HOA's actions. Clips of the failed tow attempt resurfaced, this time with dramatic music edits and sarcastic captions. The president's face, once known only to a small community, became a meme plastered across forums and feeds. The HOA board meetings grew chaotic. Attendance doubled, then tripled as residents packed into the small room, demanding answers. Voices rose, accusations flew, and for the first time, cracks in the president's authority were visible to all. A few board members dared to question the mounting legal costs. One even walked out mid-meeting, muttering about not going down with the ship, but pride can be stronger than reason. The president dug in deeper, refusing to back down. She framed the fight not as her personal vendetta, but as a noble defense of the neighborhood's dignity. She painted me as a selfish agitator, someone who was destroying the fabric of community life. Her words dripped with indignation, but her voice carried the tremor of someone who knew control was slipping. Then came the night things turned dangerous. It was just past midnight when I heard it. The faint crunch of gravel, the whisper of movement outside my window. I pulled back the curtain and froze. Two figures stood near the truck, flashlights sweeping over its surface. They weren't neighbors. They weren't police. And they weren't supposed to be there. One of them carried a tool bag. The metallic clink of wrenches echoed faintly in the night. They weren't just inspecting the truck. They were preparing to tamper with it. My pulse spiked. I grabbed my phone, hit record, and stepped quietly onto the porch. From the shadows, I captured every moment. The way they crouched near the tires. The way they whispered urgently. The way their hands moved with guilty precision. They had come to sabotage the truck. When I stepped into the light, they froze. Startled, they bolted, dropping a wrench as they scrambled into a waiting car that sped off into the night. But I had what I needed. The video was clear, and the license plate of their vehicle glowed under the street lamp. The next morning, I took the footage straight to my lawyer and, more importantly, to the police. What had been an ugly dispute over bylaws had now crossed into criminal territory. The police opened an investigation, and suddenly the HOA wasn't just facing me in civil court. They were staring down the possibility of criminal charges for whoever had been foolish enough to authorize that midnight stunt. The neighborhood erupted. Word spread quickly and outrage followed. Even those who had once sided with the HOA were shaken. It was one thing to argue about aesthetics and property values. It was another to sneak around in the dead of night, trying to sabotage a resident's property. Lines were redrawn. Support for the president plummeted. Calls for her resignation echoed through the community. Through it all, my truck remained untouched, still parked defiantly in front of the HOA office. It had survived letters, fines, towing attempts, lawsuits, and now even sabotage. What was once a target had become a fortress of principle. The HOA's desperation was finally costing them. Their credibility was shattered, their unity fractured, their reputation smeared across the internet. But pride is a stubborn thing, and the president still refused to admit defeat. Instead, she doubled down once again, vowing in her latest notice that the full power of the HOA would be brought against me. She didn't realize that the more power she claimed to wield, the more powerless she actually looked. The battle was reaching its climax. The court date loomed on the horizon, the police investigation hovered like a storm cloud, and the neighborhood itself was on the brink of revolt. The HOA had tried everything short of outright war, and each move had only backfired. And yet, I knew one final confrontation was inevitable. The lawsuit, the president, the truck, it would all come to a head soon. And when it did, there would be no going back. As I watched the truck under the glow of the streetlights that night, I felt the air crackle with anticipation. The neighborhood had become a stage, the world had become an audience, and the final act was about to begin. The weeks leading up to the court date were like living in the eye of a storm. The chaos hadn't disappeared. It had simply grown quieter, sharper, and more focused. The HOA had thrown everything they had at me, from fines to smear campaigns to midnight sabotage. And now, with nowhere else to turn, they pinned their hopes on the courtroom. For me, the anticipation was nerve-wracking but strangely liberating. I knew the truth was on my side. I had evidence, documentation, and above all, the law. My lawyer prepared meticulously, highlighting every contradiction in the HOA's bylaws and gathering witness statements from neighbors who had grown tired of the president's reign of terror. What had started as one man's defiance had become a collective pushback, and the courtroom would be the battlefield where it all came to a head. The morning of the hearing, I walked into the courthouse feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on me. Neighbors had shown up, some out of curiosity, others out of quiet support. A few even wore subtle symbols, stickers, pins, hats, as if my truck had turned into a banner they could rally under. The HOA president arrived separately, flanked by her attorney, her lips pursed into a thin line. She avoided eye contact, but her posture screamed defiance. The judge took their seat, the gavel fell, and the case began. The HOA's attorney spoke first, painting a picture of me as a disruptive force, a selfish resident who refused to comply with reasonable community standards. They waved glossy photos of my truck like it was contraband, argued that it damaged property values, and insisted that the HOA had full authority to dictate what vehicles could and couldn't be parked in driveways. But their argument was built on sand. When it was our turn, my lawyer calmly dismantled their case piece by piece. He pointed out the glaring contradictions in the HOA's bylaws, how terms like oversized and aesthetic disruption were never defined, how the rules were applied selectively, and how other vehicles of similar size had never been targeted. He introduced municipal codes proving that my truck was fully legal where it sat. He even played the video of the midnight sabotage attempt, forcing the courtroom to confront the lengths to which someone had gone to enforce this vendetta. Murmurs rippled through the spectators. The HOA president shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her facade cracking under the weight of evidence. Then came the witness statements. One by one, neighbors stood up to testify. They spoke not just about the truck, but about the years of overreach, the petty fines, the intimidation tactics. My case had opened the floodgates, and now the board's dirty laundry was on full display. By the time we rested our case, the atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. What had begun as a lawsuit about a pickup truck had transformed into a referendum on the HOA itself. The president, once so confident in her power, sat small and silent, her lawyer fumbling to salvage what little dignity remained. The judge didn't take long to deliberate. When the gavel fell again, the decision was clear. The injunction was denied, the fines were voided, and the HOA was ordered to pay my legal fees. The judge even went a step further, admonishing the association for its vague and overreaching rules, warning that future abuses could result in far harsher consequences. The courtroom erupted. Some clapped openly, others whispered in shock. The president stormed out without a word, her authority shattered in a single morning. For years, she had ruled through fear and paperwork. But in the end, it was her own pride that had brought her down. Back in the neighborhood, the fallout was immediate. The story hit the news again, this time framed as a decisive victory. Headlines read, "Resident defeats HOA in pickup truck battle," and "Judge rules against overreaching HOA." Online, the memes multiplied, celebrating the truck as the unstoppable champion of freedom. The board fractured almost overnight. Several members resigned, unwilling to continue under the weight of public ridicule. Residents began circulating petitions for reform, demanding clearer bylaws and accountability for the president's actions. Within weeks, a special election was called, and the once untouchable president was voted out by a landslide. As for me, I parked my truck back in my driveway where it belonged. No more letters, no more fines, no more harassment. The sight of it sitting there felt sweeter than ever, a daily reminder that sometimes standing your ground is enough to topple giants. But the story didn't end with just my victory. Something had shifted in the neighborhood itself. The fear that had once kept residents quiet had broken. People started planting the gardens they'd always wanted, painting their houses in colors that reflected their personalities, hosting gatherings without worrying about violating noise ordinances. It wasn't chaos, it was freedom. The kind of freedom that comes when people realize they don't have to live under the thumb of unnecessary control. Every so often, I still catch whispers of the president. She moved out quietly, unable to withstand the humiliation of her downfall. Some say she tried to join another HOA board in a different community, but the internet doesn't forget. And her name was forever tied to the pickup truck fiasco. As for the truck, it remains more than just a vehicle. Neighbors still stop by to take photos, joking about how it became the truck that saved the neighborhood. Online, people still message me, sharing their own HOA horror stories and thanking me for standing up. What began as a simple act of defiance turned into something larger, something that outgrew me entirely. Looking back, I realized the HOA never really hated the truck. They hated what it represented: independence, individuality, and the refusal to be controlled. They thought they could break me with paper and threats. Instead, they broke themselves. In the end, the lesson was simple. Sometimes the best way to fight back isn't with anger or violence, it's with patience, persistence, and a refusal to move when you know you're in the right. My truck never needed to roar its engine or tear up the street. It just needed to sit there, quietly, until the weight of their own arrogance brought the whole house of cards crashing down. And now, every morning, when I see that truck in my driveway, I don't just see metal and wheels. I see a victory. I see a neighborhood that found its voice. And I see a reminder that sometimes the simplest acts of resistance can spark the biggest changes. The HOA banned my pickup truck, so I parked it right in their driveway, and that's how I won.